Hi Bookends! Welcome to a 10-minute book review. I'm 10. Today's book review is going to be on a book that we chose for Pocathon. It was so good that we decided it deserved its own review. So, just jumping right on in. The book we're reviewing is Tell It to the World by Stan Grant. We like to start off each review with a star point, as in out of 10 stars, how many stars did this book garner, and also a rating, as in if this was a movie or a show, what do we rate it? Now, the rating part is a little bit difficult because it's not written in the way that it would be a show or a movie, because it's a memoir, so it's written the voice of the person who's writing it. So it's like they're telling you about their life, but you're not living it with them. They're just recounting it to you. So star point, I would give this a 10 out of 10. I learned so much. Rating wise, I guess if they made it into a movie, I guess it would be PG-13. But this feels more like something, like I'm reading something that I would watch on Dateline or on the History Channel. So Stan Grant, he is an Aboriginal reporter for CNN and ABC. He's reported all over the world. And he's like around my parents' age, like either in his 50s or 60s. I think he was born in the 60s, so that means he's in his 50s, I guess. But he recounts parts of his life. So it's a memoir, so it's not his life story. I believe he already wrote his life story, I want to say. But basically it's snippets in the life of, and it's written kind of, in my personal opinion, kind of an essay form. Like he's talking about different topics and he's relating those topics back to certain things that have happened in his life from childhood on into adulthood. Something I found very interesting was that I know the coloring of Aboriginal people, but I never thought that they thought of themselves as black. So that sounds like an odd thing to say, right? But hear me out. One thing that has been done to the detriment of African Americans or Black Americans is the false narrative of isolation. The narrative that you specifically, people like you only exist here because we put you here, and you look like this because of what we did to you. You are all alone and nobody else likes you, no one else identifies with you, no one else can understand what it is you're going through. You are all alone. That is the false narrative that is fed to Black Americans or African Americans. That's the narrative that we learned in school. Right? Because when they would show us pictures of Africa or pictures of indigenous people, they never looked like us. They never had clothes on. They never had the same struggles as we did. We were led to believe they had no struggles because they lived in a bush area or something. So they had no struggles. We were the only people who had struggles. Now that I'm older and I can see the world for what it is on my own, it doesn't seem as though we fare very better or very much better. It doesn't seem as though we fare much better anywhere else either. But yeah, so even when people come over to this country who are our complexion or who are darker than us or who share roots with us, there are a good amount of them who refuse to be counted in amongst Black people because it has some way become something shameful, right? We're not one of you. I'm brown. I'm not Black. That kind of a thing. That kind of demarcation, even though we could have the same shading or someone could even be darker than me. And, you know, they'll say, I'm not Black. I'm brown. Or I'm not Black. I'm this nationality. I'm that nationality. Which is also interesting because if you see someone in England, a Black person in England, they'll readily admit that they have African heritage or African roots. There's no problem with that. But they're just called British, right? the term African isn't put in front of what nation they were born in. It's just British. But when it comes to the African American black or blacks in America, that demarcation is made quickly, right? I'm not American, I am African American, even though I was born in America. My family has been here for centuries because they were brought here. But that demarcation is made very clear. As a black person in America, I can't introduce myself as American. If someone asks what I am, I either have to go by black, which is a color, or African American. That demarcation has to be put in. If I just introduce myself as American, people, no. And so that narrative of isolation, as in, this is what you are, this is the ball that you're in, and no one else is with you. You are by yourself. Reading this book by Stan Grant, I had no idea that Aborigines considered themselves as black. I had no idea that they identified with the civil rights movement. A lot of stuff that happened to them I had no real idea about. My first lesson in Aboriginal culture and the things that are being done to them was with a movie called Rabbit Proof Fences that me and my sister saw when we were younger. And it was about children being stolen. If their skin was light enough, they were being taken away from their parents, and the girls were being married off to white men, you know, once they were of age, so that they could have clever children. Clever just meaning lighter skin. Which is interesting because with African Americans, when we were being raped and bred for the purpose of slavery, you know, we were never raped and bred for the purpose of becoming clever. Like, no one ever assumed that we would become in any way smarter by the lightening of the color of our skin. We were always just assumed to be dull and stupid. The lightening of our skin was only because lighter skinned blacks were seen as more scenic, more visually appealing than our darker skinned counterparts, right? So that's kind of odd to think that someone would believe that by lightening the skin of another person through the generations, you now have made that other person more intelligent, or that race more intelligent. So that's weird. And the weirdest part was that some of the Aboriginal people believed that. Not all of them, like, but a small percentage of them actually believed what they were being told, that lighter skin meant intelligent children. And of course, in the African American community, you gotta turn the mirror right back on yourself. So in the African American community, there are many African Americans who see lighter skin as a touch tone of beauty. So colonization has touched both of our peoples, and I personally had no idea that colonization had touched the Aboriginal people just as much as it has touched African Americans. So learning from Stan Grant, apparently he grew up in poverty, which was deliberately designed by the Australian government for the Aboriginal people, because I guess if you keep these people in poverty, then they'll never rise up and reach out for anything better. If they assume there is nothing better to be reached for, or that if there is something better to be reached for, that they'll never reach it. His father was hardworking. He worked a lot of laborer jobs in order to put food on his family's table. His mother was also hardworking. Stan said that he was a smart kid, but unfortunately he wasn't able to show how smart he was because they were always moving. And the reason why they were always moving was because of the racism that they faced, the institutionalized racism that they faced, as well as the people around them. So to give an example, he mentioned the welfare men. They were always afraid of the white trucks or the white vans or the white cars driven by the welfare men. What these people would do is they'd be sent from the government, and they would check the children for lice, ask them what they ate for dinner, what they have for lunch, how it is they live, knowing good and well that these people did not have a lot of money, if any money at all. that of course they're going to be huddled together. Of course, there's not going to be a lot for dinner or a lot for lunch because there just wasn't a lot to go around. And so they were taking these children. This is back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They were taking these children to missions or government ran missions. And I guess foster caring them or keeping them, just like they were doing in Rabbit Proof Fences. I'm not sure when that movie, what era that movie was set in. But yeah, he was afraid of the welfare men. And that was a deliberate, that was something that was so deliberately. Like over here, when we hear about welfare and DIFUS, it's supposed to be taking children from abusive situations, right? Like a child's getting beat, a child's getting raped, a child is getting malnourished, right? So over here, DIFUS and welfare are looked at as institutions that are there to protect children. Over there, at the time, welfare was basically, I'm snatching your kid. I don't care what you're doing, I'm snatching your kid. I don't care if you don't got money, I'm snatching your kid. It's mine now, and I'm gonna do what I want with your kid. And of course there were abuses that were going on in the welfare system because power unchecked is power that destroys, right? So he was afraid of the welfare men, and so was his family. So they moved around a lot. He also spoke about the camaraderie that he had with his family, with his fellow Aborigines and with his family. Which is interesting because in the African American community, right, where I live, most people are hand to mouth. Most of us don't have a lot of money. We have enough to pay our bills for the week and maybe a little bit left over and maybe a little bit to save. But we also don't feel like we're drowning either, because if everybody's poor, then nobody's poor. I thought it was funny when he said that some people actually thought that his family was rich just because his dad had a job. I remember growing up, some people thought that my family was rich because my dad had a job and my mom never had to work. But the fact of the matter is, we were not rich. My dad had 3 jobs and my mom had 4 kids to take care of. So we weren't rich. We were in the same boat as everybody else. It's just my dad was doing paddling on one side, on the working side, and my mom was doing paddling on the other side, the taking care of the house and kids side. But we were still in the same boat. It's just interesting to see. This man is on a whole nother other continent, and he was raised decades ago, and yet his story mirrors a lot of what African Americans over here have experienced in America. I thought that was interesting. Also, he likes James Baldwin. James Baldwin kind of caused a revolution in his mind to let him know that, hey, you're not alone. What you're going through over here in Australia as a Black Aborigine, we're going through the other side of the world as an African American Black. Now, I love James Baldwin. I love the sound of his voice. I love the sound of his writing. I remember one of my history teachers in high school called him a angry man with literary skill. A literary, what did he call him? Basically, he called him an angry Black man who could write. I didn't see James Baldwin as an angry Black man who could write. I saw him as a intelligent African American man who could see injustice and also had the poise and the intelligence to be able to write it down in a way that the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that would be able to understand it. Like his words written from the 1950s, I believe he was in the 50s, still resonate now, and they're still understandable. So he liked James Baldwin. For him, that caused him to realize that he was not alone. And it also gave Stan a way of self-identifying, right? Because if you don't have anything to hold your problems up to, as a gauge or as a touchstone, you have no idea of how bad your problems are or how light your problems are. So it made him not feel so alone in the world. As he gets older, he starts to feel the restlessness that everyone else starts to, feel as they get older. He was encouraged by his schoolmaster or headmaster, I think they're called. I think it's the principal. Over here we call them principals, so I'm guessing that the headmaster is the principal. Could be wrong. But the headmaster encouraged them to quit school at 15, since by law they had to go to school up until 15. One interesting thing I thought that was good that the government did was they had an initiative program for Aboriginal children to encourage Aboriginal children to stay in school. And they would give them like a small stipends, a very small stipends. Maybe it seemed like a lot in the 60s. I don't know, $3. $3 seems like $3 no matter what decade you're in. But anyway, so there was a program to encourage them to stay in school. However, the actual people in the school had such low standards and low expectations for the Aboriginal children that they're like, listen, why should you even stay in here? You're only gonna pick fruit or be a construction worker or work in a factory. Just quit now. Go get one of those jobs. And maybe by 25, you'll be like a manager's assistant. Not a manager, because you're still black, so that ain't gonna happen for you. But a manager's assistant. And unfortunately, a lot of Aboriginal children fell into that. Like, yeah, you're right. I'm black. I ain't never gonna have nothing good. So, yeah, you're right. Stan stayed in school and eventually became a journalist. And when he became a journalist, that allowed him to be able to travel. And once again, hold your problems up so that you can see it. Hold your problems up against the problems of others. So he was able, by traveling, he was able to hold his problems up as being an Aborigine, being mistreated, having land stolen, having people murdered, being disproportionately targeted by the police. He was able to hold that up against what was happening around the world and see, wait a minute, not only is this nothing new for us, it's nothing new for anyone else. That caused him to speak out even more about the atrocities that had happened to the Aboriginal people and the atrocities that still happen because they are still targeted. I believe he said they are 3% of the population but are 50% more likely to be incarcerated as children. So how are you 3% of a whole population and 50% more likely to go to jail? It's not fair. Also, he brought up the case of Adam Goodes, or Godes, Goodes. I'm not into soccer, so I don't know who he is, but apparently he was playing a game on Australia Day, I want to say, and he was racially booed off of the field. I guess the white Australians felt like his black skin didn't fit in with what they considered an Australian to be, and they booed him so badly he left the field. And they felt no remorse for this. And so this is another speaking point of his, that he's like, listen, we were here first and we have become integrated. So why can't you just treat us as equals? Or at least not a lesser than. Like, you ain't gotta like us, but you ain't gotta treat us like this either. I was so intrigued by this book that I actually Googled Stan Grant and I looked up one of his YouTube, well, it's not a YouTube video of his, it was just a recording of him on YouTube. And what I was expecting to see was, I don't know, I was expecting to see and hear a loud man, right? Not an uneducated man, but a loud man. Like in America, when it comes to civil rights, when it came to the civil rights movement, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, these were men whose voices carried. You know, they didn't have to be saying anything particularly horrible because they weren't, but their voices carried, their voices were loud, their voices were heavy. And so in my mind, when I think of an activist for the civil rights of a people, those faces come to mind and those voices come to mind. So when I pulled up the video of him on YouTube, I was expecting to see someone who back straight, voice loud, eyes burning. What I saw was something a little bit different. His back was straight, his head was high, but his voice wasn't loud. It was actually conversational. It was, listen, Australia, you know what you did. I'm going to remind you of what you've done, but you know what you did, and you need to do better. And I thought to myself, this is not who I was thinking that I was going to see. But then I have to remember too, experiences, life experiences, mold how it is you are and what it is you say and how it is you say it. Now, he cut no corners. He cut absolutely no corners in what it is he said. He spoke about the poison water hole. There is this place called Poison Water Hole, where they actually poisoned the water hole to kill the Aborigines. And there's Murder Island, where they gathered all the Aborigines up together and shot them. You know, so he laid it all bare. But he laid it bare in a way that the audience listening to him would feel shame, but not dejection. Like, we did a bad thing, we just need to make it better. And that caught me off guard, because I was thinking, no, feel shame, you're bad people. But if you think about it, if you want someone to change what they're doing, then you can't come at them making them feel like you're about to fight them, right? It worked over here, but there are a whole lot more black people over here who are willing to say, I'm not taking it no more, we done. As opposed to the Aboriginal people who are still 3% of the population. So I get it. His approach had to be a little bit different in the way of civil rights than the approach of people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And so even though he gained strength from these people and from James Baldwin, his approach on how he would try to help his people had to be a different approach. Slightly different, because he was still scathing in what he said. He still laid it bare. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He didn't call it, you know, the sleeping island where you put all the Aborigines to sleep. No, he put it out there. Murder Island, where you murdered them and you buried babies alive. But he said it in a way that shamed without distancing. I like this man. I like him a lot. And also, he doesn't preach hate, right? He's not saying to hate white Australians. He's not saying to kick them out the country. He's not saying to ban them from land or ban them for rights or do what they've done to his people to them. He's definitely not preaching hate. I believe his second wife is a white woman, which makes his youngest child half white. So he's not preaching hate. I believe he's also partially white. I think he said his grandmother, his great-grandmother or grandmother is white. So he's not a hate mongerer. He's just someone who wants something better for the Aboriginal people, which is basically just to be treated like they are Australian. You know, not to be called, he has nothing wrong being called Aboriginal. He has nothing against being called Aboriginal. But for them to feel like they're fully, inclusively Australians. Which is interesting because, once again, the isolation of the African American black, if I'm to introduce myself as what nationality I am, I either have to say, once again, black as a color, right? Or African American. If I was white, even if I was German white, French white, Italian white, Irish white, Scandinavian white, Swiss white, it wouldn't even matter. If I had any of those roots, but was also born in America, if someone asked me what I was, I could quite proudly and normally and without any pause say American. And without any pause, that person would accept it. But as a black person it wouldn't matter if I was Hispanic black, African black, Islander black, Asian black. If I'm born in America, I have to say African American. It doesn't matter what my roots are, I would be African American or black. So I find it interesting that the struggles are the same, and I really enjoyed this book because it made me feel less alone. And it's not to say that misery loves company. It's not in that kind of a way. It's in the way of this bubble isn't the only bubble. And it's good to know that it's bigger than what it feels like. That I'm not as alone as what I've been made to feel like throughout my entire school career. That we are not the only black people or people who identify as black on the planet Earth. That we're not just the huddled together masses, you know, by ourselves that nobody likes. That there are others who identify with us and who know our struggles and who understand us. So yeah, I really like Stan Grant. I wish that I had more works by him. I'm going to look up some more things by him. He reminds me a little bit of James Baldwin, except James Baldwin did write stories. He wrote essays too, but he also wrote stories. I think his favorite was Tell It to the Mountain. I believe Stan's favorite was Tell It to the Mountain, which is about well, anyway, you can Google that. I'm sorry, because this is about Stan. So yep, this was a great book. Really did love it. 10 out of 10 stars. If you like what you see, then like and subscribe. Bye, Bookends.